Welcome to the Alice Paul Center podcast series, bringing you the latest in gender, sexuality, and queer scholarship and practice.
My name is Eileen Malcolm, and I'm a PhD student in English at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm also one of the organizers of the Transliteracy Project, a new initiative at Penn, sponsored by the Alice Paul Center. I'm extremely pleased to welcome Heath Davis, Professor of Political Science and Director of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies at Temple University. Heath teaches courses on anti-discrimination law, democratic political theory, and the politics of race, gender, and sexuality. He provides consulting services to businesses seeking to design and implement trans-inclusive policies, and he is an advocate for marginalized communities in Philadelphia, having served as a member of the Philadelphia Mayoral Commission on LGBT Affairs and the Leeway Foundation Board of Directors. We are absolutely delighted to have him with us, and welcome to the podcast, Heath.
Thank you. I'm pleased to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
So just to start off, academics these days are under a lot of pressure to produce excellent scholarship and also to be excellent teachers, but you have also made community activism central to your work. I'm wondering if you could start us off by talking about how you balance your research, your teaching, and your activism, and the degree to which you see those parts of your life as speaking to each other.
Wow, that's a big question to start with, but it's a good one, and I'm happy to talk about it. I mean, for me, as a political philosopher, my research has been very important to me. It's been important for me to get outside of the classroom and to make connections to the community. And so it's really been within the last maybe 10 years of my career that I've sort of gotten involved in local Philadelphia political activism, specifically around trans civil rights in the city. And it's been a really terrific experience to build those connections with people in the community. My experience on the Mayor's Commission was fabulous. It was just incredible to be in a room full of activists and professionals in all sorts of different fields, talking about these issues and figuring out practical strategies. And I think that's the thing that's sort of been the turn in my career in the last few years, to sort of yes, talk about the concepts and in a serious way, but also to make them useful to this sort of the consulting work that I've done has really been about translating a lot of what we do in gender studies to people who are working in different organizations, you know, whether it's a bunch of family lawyers I gave a presentation to over the summer in Canada, or businesses, you know, like Fortune 500 companies or small organizations, foundations, nonprofits. So I think it's just been fantastic. I mean, it's really, you set it up really nicely, actually, because all of those things do come together. I end up talking about my kind of practical consulting work with my students, and I feel like that's interesting. It seems like that's interesting to them, because it's a real world kind of application of some of the stuff that we talk about in class.
You said that you started doing that quite recently, that kind of activist work. Were there specific factors in making you want to do more of that work?
Mm-hmm. You know, the personal factor of having transitioned later in life at the age of 38, and I'm 48 now. So that was, you know, driving a lot of just sort of for my own self, looking for resources in the community, and so many activist and support organizations helped me in terms of my own personal journey, that it was important and it made sense to contribute and to maintain a lot of those connections. So yeah, I mean, really sort of those things, and I think also being at a point in my career also where I was looking for just, you know, ways to be of genuine help in a sense. Yeah, so I would think those factors, yeah.
That actually leads into something else I wanted to ask you about, which is the way that you foreground your personal narrative in a lot of your scholarship. I'm thinking about how you've written about transitioning while teaching, or the bathroom narratives in Beyond Trans, where you write about passing and not passing in airport bathrooms. And I'm wondering how that's been working out for you. Specifically, I think a lot of academics feel the pressure to seem disinterested in their subject material and to kind of be aloof and dissociated, but you've emphatically refused that, and I wonder about the affordances of that approach for you.
And, I think when it comes down to it, I'm basically an introvert, like a lot of academics, and it's sort of ironic that a lot of introverts come to this profession because we've spent our lives and are, reading books and sort of spending time by ourselves and studying and thinking. And then you're sort of cast into the classroom, and you have to become a public speaker and you have to learn how to be extroverted in certain ways. So as far as my own story and how it relates to my work, there is the kind of critique out there that, people like me are kind of just doing like me search, I think is like the latest little term for that. Like you're focusing on issues that affect your own life. And, I have a lot of responses to that. One is that we all do that kind of work that's important to us. So I don't have a problem with that criticism. However, it has been a bit of a tricky balance to figure out like where my personal comfort zone is in terms of disclosing details of my own life. And I decided that I would do what I've always done, which is not to kind of lead with my own story, because the book Beyond Trans is not an autobiography. I weave in aspects of my own experience as I see fit, that where I think that they'll be helpful, and kind of like making the reader understand that here's somebody who's gone through those experiences. And I do talk about my experiences with public restrooms in the book, and I think the really powerful point that I want to make there, and why I think it's important that I sort of inject my own details of my own life there, is because what seems like just a trans issue about discrimination in terms of bathrooms is really about the policing of female masculinity, and I lived that experience for the first 38 years of my life, well, minus a few when I was an infant, but as a little kid being reprimanded for being in the wrong bathroom and what that looked like later in life. I think that this is an important message to get out to the public at large, because the narrative right now is very distorted. The narrative in our political climate is that this just affects a very small, tiny percent of people who self-identify as trans. And in fact, the issue of transgender discrimination impacts so many more people, cisgendered, non-trans people. So I think that I felt like it was important to talk about my own story, and having, what it was like to be in Heathrow Airport and have a custodian come in and say not only you're in the wrong bathroom, but to challenge me on that when I insisted that I wasn't. And that's a common experience for girls and women who are androgynous in their appearance or more masculine presenting.
You address this in Beyond Trans, but I'm wondering if you could say a little bit for our listeners about how you see gender and sex-based discrimination affecting cisgender and non-transgender people as well.
Mm-hmm. The impact is huge, and I think it just, I appreciate the follow-up question because it really builds on what I was talking about previously. We try to talk as if, well, right now, while we're recording this interview, we're in a moment in our political climate where federal agencies are talking about coming up with a very narrow definition of what sex is, and this is an immutable characteristic that's determined by your genitals. And if we can't do it that way, then we're going to do genetic testing. And my response is that in gender, sexuality, and women's studies, this is for decades, there's a whole trove of research that tells us why this is not an adequate response. And in part, it's an effort to define sexism so narrowly that it, as if it just impacts cisgender heterosexual women in a certain kind of way. And my argument, and I try to do this in the book, is to show that trans discrimination is a thin edge of a wedge that opens up to everybody, essentially, when it comes down to it, because it's about gender policing. If you think about the bathroom issue, when I give talks, I always talk about the fact that there's also just traditional sexism in sex-segregated bathrooms, because, as we all know, a lot of us know who have been in these lines, the lines for women's bathrooms in public spaces are often extremely long, and so women, there's a time disadvantage that is a clear case of sex discrimination. And in fact, we had cases in the 1980s that called like the potty parity cases, where women sued venues and in a lot of cases won. And the answer to that was to build more stalls in women's bathrooms, but never to really challenge the sex segregation at the root of it all. And I think when I try to make this point, I think that cisgender women can kind of see that. Now, whether that's going to like translate into, like a greater movement to really move away from sex segregated restrooms is another question. But the concept of sexism, undoubtedly, I mean, it impacts everybody. So I think that that's such an important message to get out there, that it can't be sort of isolated into these different like forms. You have to talk about it holistically, I think.
Absolutely. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about the particular challenges that present themselves to people in already marginalized communities when they decide to come out as transgender.
Yeah. I mean, that's another big question. And it's true. So I'm biracial, and I was actually born in the U.S. and have an African-American birth father and a white birth mother, and was adopted by a white Canadian couple and raised in Canada. I definitely have been impacted, to be perceived generic brown person, and people didn't often know what to make of me unless I was in a specific context. So it has been a shift to be read as a man of color, and often I'm perceived as young, even though I'm not anymore. So it's like a compliment, but not really, because then you don't get the respect that goes with being 48 years old. That said, I think in a lot of ways, I also have to point out that I have a tremendous amount of class privilege, and also being a tenured professor, I never had to worry about my job security in the way that a lot of trans people have. I talk about like the SEPTA trans pass case in the book, which, here in Philadelphia, people will recognize when we used to have gender markers on the bus passes. And I talk about Charlene Arcilla, a black trans woman who was an activist and really fought for these to be removed. But I also point out in telling that story that I used the bus when I lived down in Center City as well, but I was a periodic bus user, so I didn't have to get a monthly pass, and I didn't have to rely on public transportation solely for getting around. And I think that that's a tremendous difference between me, my situation, and somebody like Charlene who did.
In your work on the former SEPTA TransPass system, and in your previous work, you've thought a lot about the accessibility of urban spaces for trans and gender nonconforming people. I'm wondering if you could speak about the design, systems, or advocacy measures that are useful for producing and maintaining trans-inclusive urban spaces, and perhaps specifically about how your research has become tied to Philadelphia.
Yeah, I became very interested in the concept of universal design, and I first heard about it when I was a participant in a workshop about pedagogy at Temple, actually, and somebody presented and talked about how universal design could be adopted in the classroom, and I was really intrigued by this. For just a simple example of having closed captioning on videos that we show in our classrooms, can help people who maybe have English as a second language, might have a hearing impairment, and other people as well, and at the end of the day, it doesn't negatively impact anybody. So I was interested in these potentially win-win scenarios where you can design things, structure things differently with the needs of the most disadvantaged in mind in doing the design, but also in ways that benefit everybody. And I think that universal design, which is sometimes also called inclusive design, works for some things, but not everything. And so I've been interested to talk to my students about this, and they point out some problems with it. But I think that when it comes to something like designing public restrooms, it could be very, very helpful to think about the architecture of these spaces. I mean, I would say North American too. Let's throw in Canada also. I think this is widely acknowledged that this is a sort of an aspect of architecture that has been neglected, and we don't pay a lot of attention to how we design public restrooms, and in consequence, we don't have very good public restrooms. I think the issue of the sort of the quote-unquote transgender bathroom issue that has captivated this country in certain ways with the North Carolina efforts to make it so that you had to show a birth certificate to access a public restroom that was sex segregated. I think that we could solve the problem by building bathrooms differently. And in fact, in Center City, as I talk about, we have a lot of restaurants who have decided to have floor-to-ceiling partition stalls, which give people their individual privacy, which is essentially the number one thing that I think everybody wants when they use a public restroom, regardless of gender. And these bathroom designs often, so you'll have like a semicircle or a row of individual stalls that give people their privacy, and then you have like the mirrors and the sinks in the middle where everybody uses them. And what I find so interesting about this is, number one, a lot of these restaurants moved to do this not because they were thinking about inclusive design necessarily, but it was like a space issue. So it made business sense for them to do this. And also that a lot of people don't even notice what's happening, like, so you go into some of these restaurants and there's a bathroom, you go in, you have privacy, you come out, and so what if you see other people at the sink who are maybe, so I think if we can replicate that model in other places, I think ultimately that architectural solution is preferable for so many reasons, and it benefits everybody.
So Canada has fairly recently announced that it's going to be joining the ranks of countries that permit you to have a third gender option on your passport, the X designator, or a sex option. You talk about this a little bit in Beyond Trans, but what would your response be to that measure?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm proud of Canada in a lot of ways because they've surged ahead with a lot of, I think, trans inclusive or trans-friendly policies. The addition of a third sex marker category, I think the intentions are good in terms of inclusion, but ultimately it raises a number of problems as well. And I talk about this as, I think there are two liberal strategies that have been used in transgender civil rights advocacy. One is the assimilation framework, where you just assimilate people into the existing binary so that people like me just assimilate into the men's restroom. Now, the accommodation is the addition of the third bathroom, which is the model that is being used in a lot of places, and also with a lot of, well, not a lot, but I think that I can't remember, there's a handful of states now where you can get a driver's license with an X also on it. And California lets you change your birth certificate to have an X marker also. The problem with that, I think, is that number one, it can be stigmatizing to tell people, trans people or intersex people, gender nonconforming people, that they have to go to a third category, a different bathroom. And also with passports and birth certificates and driver's licenses, it's not clear how these will be interpreted by the people who administrate these things, because we don't have any like uniform policies for that. So that it raises a lot of questions. So instead of like cutting down on the administrative difficulties, it kind of creates another layer of bureaucracy that now we're putting administrative agents in the awkward position, difficult position, and of interpreting the meaning.
Right. Creating a temporary solution where a more permanent structural change is needed.
Yeah, and I feel like, I've seen sometimes like on simple, like forms at the doctor or in different like job applications, maybe there have been ad hoc efforts to maybe say like male, female, or transgender, or, like a whole bunch of different things. And you do run into the problem of like infinite number of like additional categories, because as we know, the term transgender is really an umbrella for a whole bunch of different gender identities that are not mainstream. So people who are gender fluid or gender queer, or non-binary, identify somewhere in between or as both male and female, and it varies. So what do you even mean by like a transgender category, and what's meant by an X category too? I know for some people that means non-binary. For other people, it means they don't have a gender at all. Or for other people, they might just, for whatever reasons, not want to indicate a binary sex designation on their passport.
In thinking of bringing trans issues to higher levels of management or administration at universities or in corporations, how would you recommend that we do this without placing an additional burden on the people who are most likely to be affected by existing and new policies?
Yeah. I think this is a really important issue, and I'm glad that we're getting to it. When I give talks, I often get the question, as do a lot of people in my position, about what allies can do. What does it mean to be a good ally? How can I support? What could I do to help trans people? And I have a very clear directive, which is I would love for everybody to think about the organizations that they're a member of, and to then think about the gender policies that are a part of that organization. Whether it's something like a sex-segregated recreational sports league, or a support group that's maybe sex-segregated, or sex-segregated bathrooms, or just anywhere that a dress code that might have gender in it. I would sincerely appreciate, and I think a lot of trans people would appreciate, non-trans people advocating or asking those questions and doing that work. I talk about in the book this idea of a gender audit, where you just sort of look internally and see like, where does gender or sex pop up in our administrative framework here, in the language that we use. And I think that it's not everything, but it's a huge thing to really question those. And when you find a sex or gender policy that is extraneous or does not have a legitimate function, that can't be accomplished by some other means, building restrooms differently, like we talked about before, I think that I would love for allies to encourage getting rid of those policies and building new ones that make more sense, that are sensitive to, again, the needs of trans and gender nonconforming people, but also that can be helpful to other people as well. So I think at least in that organizational, institutional setting, going for those sorts of wins, in a sense, is a very strategically helpful thing to do. And often a lot of organizations respond better to that, in a sense, because you're providing a solution and doing and something constructive for people to actually do. So those conversations, I think, should be happening, and rather than putting trans and non-binary people in the position of having those meetings and doing that work, that labor, I would love to see people who want to be allies do that work.
How do you encourage those sorts of perspectives in your consulting work?
So a couple things come to mind. One is just basically like talking to organizations about like what they're trying to accomplish. And often people are not clear because they're put into these positions that have existed for a long time, and you're just doing a lot of things in a gendered way because it's force of habit. It's just always been done. It's social custom. There's no really thought going into it. So I think to get that sort of level of introspection, a lot of like people who are leaders in organizations are actually appreciative of that because they can understand how that's beneficial to them and they can do their jobs better. So appealing to people's sort of best interests is important. But the other thing connected to this response is just to point out that I work with companies and organizations who are ready to make this move, So people who are not in that place, organizations who are not in that place, so we know about trans people, we want to be inclusive, we want to do the right thing, but we just don't know what to do, so we want to bring you in to help us. That's very different from going into a place that's hostile to the very concept of trans identities, and that's not the space that I've worked in.
Have you had mentors in the trans community, and have you been a mentor yourself?
Yes, I have. My mind goes to, there's a conference that happens every year in Philadelphia. It used to be called the Trans Health Conference. It's now the Trans Wellness Conference. And it's the biggest conference of its kind in the nation. And it was started by Charlene Arcilla. A lot of people don't realize that, who was a quiet pioneer in a lot of things in Philadelphia with respect to trans activism. I remember going there prior to my transition and just being in awe of being in a space with other people. Again, there's a lot of diversity, but with other people who were going through similar things, and to have that sense of belonging and also a place for resources, and that's incredibly important for people. I definitely found mentors within that space, and I was happy to return the favor to other people as well.
Continuing along these lines, or in terms of future projects, what are you most excited about right now?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I'm most excited about being the new director of our gender, sexuality, and women's studies program at Temple. I believe in this program and others like it in other places. I believe in the history. I believe in the political insistence of these programs, and so it's incredibly meaningful to me to be in the position to energize the program. And increasingly, I would say in the current moment, I think that a lot of people in general, but especially young people, are looking for ways to make sense of the things that are happening in our culture right now, and politically, things that are being said and discussed and debated, and civil rights that are being challenged. And so to be in a place where we can give a cultural and a theoretical context and a historical context to these issues, I think is really important. And my own strong belief is that it's a program that belongs like across the university. So that's one of the things that's sort of on my radar, is to sort of build and enhance those connections, because I think that every undergraduate could benefit from a double major in gender studies or having a minor in LGBT studies. There's been a lot of movement in our culture, especially in the business community. Over half of Fortune 500 companies now have trans inclusive policies, include us in their discrimination policies, and also in terms of healthcare. So that's a huge thing that has happened, really within the past, 5 to 10 years, but a lot has happened recently. So I could talk a lot about that, but that's what I'm most excited about. In my own research, I have a project that is ongoing, and I'm still working on it, that looks at gender segregation in terms of prisons and jails, which is it was going to be one of the chapters of my book, but it's a tough case study to really to dig into, but that's interesting and important to me as well, to ask that question. Do we really need sex segregation in our prisons? We assume if there's anywhere that we need to keep men and women separated, it's in jails and prisons. But that has a lot of homophobia driving that, and a lot of assumptions that we haven't really questioned. So I'm looking forward to working on that too.
I'm looking forward to that as well. I'm looking forward to your project, and congratulations on the new position.
Thank you.
We're very grateful that you've decided to join us tonight and continue paying it forward.
Thank you. Thanks for the interview. This has been a great conversation.
You've been listening to the Alice Paul Center podcast series. To listen to other episodes, please go to the Alice Paul Center website at the University of Pennsylvania.